She knocked on my door at 7 p.m. on my birthday with a piece of paper I had completely forgotten existed. It was folded into quarters, soft at the creases in the way that paper gets when it has lived in the same place for a very long time. She held it out without saying anything, and I took it, and I unfolded it, and there it was, written in two different handwritings, mine and hers, in the alternating way we used to write things when we were 11 years old and believed that taking turns made something more official. If we are both still single when we are 30, we have to try. Below that, in her handwriting, this is a pinky promise. Below that, in mine, this is also a pinky promise. And then two sets of initials, underlined twice. I looked up from the note. She was standing in my doorway in her coat, her hair a little damp from the November cold, and she was looking at me with the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is now fully committed to whatever comes next. She said, "You're 30. So am I." And then she waited. My name is James Calloway. I am, as of today, 30 years old. I work in urban planning for the city, zoning assessments, land use review, the careful management of how much space things are allowed to take up, which is perhaps the most accurate job description for the kind of person I have always been. I drive a car I maintain diligently. I keep a clean kitchen. I am reliable in the way that slightly lonely people are reliable. Nothing falls through the cracks, because staying busy is its own kind of company. Her name was Nora Finch. She had been my best friend from the age of 7 until the age of 18, when she went to university in Edinburgh and I stayed and went to the one 2 hours from home. And the shape of our friendship slowly reformed itself around phone calls, and then texts, and then the occasional visit. Stretched thin over distance the way good things sometimes are, still there, still real, but requiring more deliberate effort to hold. We had grown up 3 houses apart on the same street, which meant that for 11 years the geography of my life included her as a fixed point. She was the person I called when my dog died at 14. She was the person who made me practice my driving test answers out loud until I stopped second-guessing every question. She was the person I told, at 15, that I thought I might be in love with someone, and she had listened carefully and asked the right questions and helped me understand that what I felt was real and that I should say so. I did. It didn't work out. She was the person I called after that, too. She was a graphic designer now. She had moved back to the city 8 months ago, which I knew, because she had texted me when it happened, back in town. Same time zone. Let's not be strangers. And we had had dinner once, and it had been easy in the way that things are easy when the foundation is solid regardless of the distance. And I had walked home afterward thinking that I should do that more often, and then not arranged it for 8 months. Because I am a man who is good at intentions and intermittent about follow-through. She had a prop. The thing I would come to understand in retrospect was always there, always the same, always more loaded than it appeared. A small canvas tote bag, faded olive green, worn at the handles, that she carried instead of a handbag. She'd had it since university, or one like it, and it went with her everywhere. I would later learn this was where she'd been keeping the note, folded into quarters in the inside pocket. For how long exactly she wouldn't tell me the first time I asked, and told me on a Tuesday evening 4 months later when she had run out of reasons to keep it a secret. The note had been written on a Saturday afternoon in October when we were 11. She had been at my kitchen table doing homework, and I had been not doing homework, and the conversation had somehow arrived at the topic of marriage, the way conversations did when you were 11 and had been watching too many rom-coms with your mother, and she had said very seriously that she thought people should have a backup plan. I had agreed. We had written the note. We had performed the pinky promise with great solemnity. We had gone back to our homework. I had forgotten about it within a week. She had kept it for 19 years. This is the detail that reorganized everything. I stood in the doorway holding the note in the November cold on my 30th birthday, which I had been planning to spend alone with a reasonable dinner and a book, both of which now felt very far away, and I looked at Nora Finch, who had driven 40 minutes across the city with a piece of paper we had written at age 11, and I tried to assemble a thought that was adequate to the situation. I said, "You kept this." She said, "Yes," I said, "for 19 years." She said, "I'm aware of the timeline." I said, "Come inside." She came inside. She set her tote bag on the kitchen counter the way she had always set things down in my house. Without asking, without ceremony, like a person who knows where things go. I put the kettle on because it was the most useful thing I could find to do with my hands. And she sat at the kitchen table. And for a moment we were 11 years old again, and everything was the same, except that it was entirely different. I unfolded the note again and looked at it. The handwriting was painfully young, the oversized letters of children who are still learning how much space they're allowed to take up on the page. I said, "I forgot about this." She said, "I know." I said, "You didn't." She looked at me steadily. "No." The kettle began to build toward a boil. Outside, the city was doing the November thing, dark early, lights on in all the windows, the muffled quiet of cold streets. I stood at the counter and held a piece of paper I had written 19 years ago and tried to understand the shape of what she was telling me. She had kept it. That was not an accident. You do not keep something folded in a coat pocket for 19 years by accident. You keep it because it means something. And the meaning compounds quietly, year over year, in the way that things do when you don't examine them too closely, but you also can't bring yourself to throw them away. I said, "How long have you had it with you? Not in a drawer somewhere. With you." She looked at the table. A pause. "Then, since I moved back." 8 months. That landed. The tea was something to do for 7 minutes. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table, the same configuration as the kitchen table at my parents' house 23 years ago, minus the homework. And she wrapped both hands around her mug the way she always had, since she was small. And I looked at her and understood that I had been looking at her my whole life without doing the necessary accounting. I said, "Why today?" She said, "Because the note said 30. I said, "You could have not shown me. You could have just let today pass." She looked at me. "I could have," she said. "I've been deciding for 8 months. I said, "What made you decide?" She looked at her tea. She ran her thumb along the rim of the mug once, deliberate, the way she touched things she was thinking about. "I had dinner with my mother last week," she said. "She asked me if I was seeing anyone. I said no. She asked if there was anyone I was thinking about. She stopped. I waited. I was quiet for too long," she said. "She's my mother," she noticed. A small pause. She said, "Is it James?" And I said. She stopped again. I said, "What did you say?" She looked up at me. I said it was complicated. Her voice was even, but her thumb had gone still on the mug. And she said, "It's only complicated if you haven't told him yet." The kitchen was very quiet. I said, "Nora." She said, I know this is a piece of paper we wrote when we were 11, and I know that's absurd, and I know you probably haven't thought about it in 20 years. But I couldn't." She stopped, looked at the note, which was on the table between us, unfolded, in 2 handwritings. I couldn't keep carrying it around and not say anything. It started to feel dishonest. I looked at her across the table. at her hands around the mug, at the olive tote bag on my counter, at the person who had been a fixed point in my life since I was 7 years old. And I thought about the note, and the 19 years, and the 8 months of carrying it, and I tried to locate, with some accuracy, what I actually felt. What I found was this, that every time Nora Finch had come back into my life at a distance, a phone call, a text. The dinner 8 months ago, there had been something I did after, something I didn't name, a specific kind of quiet that settled in me when I drove home from seeing her. Not missing, not longing, closer to the feeling of a room where you've left the light on, warm in the periphery, not urgent, always there. I had told myself this was simple friendship. I had poor survival instincts around the obvious. I said, "Can I tell you something?" She looked up. I said, "When you texted me that you'd moved back." 8 months ago. I looked at the note. I read it 3 times. She was very still. "I don't read texts 3 times, I said. "I read receipts and zoning amendments 3 times. I don't read texts." I looked at her. I didn't ask myself why. I should have. She said nothing. Her thumb had gone still on the mug rim. She was looking at me the way she looked at things she was deciding whether to believe. I said, "The dinner, 4 months ago, whenever it was." I walked home. She said, "You live 40 minutes away." "I know," I said. I wanted the air. I wanted to. I stopped. I told myself I'd walk until I figured out what I was thinking about, and I walked the whole way home, and when I got there, I still hadn't figured it out, and I told myself that meant there was nothing to figure out. She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, not relief, not yet, but the easing of something that had been held very carefully for a long time. She said quietly, "That's not nothing, James." I said, "No, I'm realizing that now." She looked down at the note. Then she slid it, slowly, across the table toward me, not taking it back, not reclaiming it, leaving it on my side. She said, "I don't need you to decide anything tonight. I just needed you to know." I looked at the note. At the 2 handwritings, the underlined initials, the pinky promise declared twice in the careful, oversized letters of children who wanted to be very sure. I put my hand flat on the table next to it. She looked at my hand. I said, "I'm not going to need tonight." She looked up. I said, I walked 40 minutes home and stood in my kitchen and still couldn't name what I was thinking about. I'm looking at you right now, and I know exactly what I'm thinking about. Those are not the same situation. She held my gaze. Her eyes were bright in a way she was not trying to manage. She said, "You're sure?" I said, "I wrote half of that note." She laughed then, surprised and sudden and real, the laugh that had been exactly the same since she was 8 years old. And she put her hand out across the table, and I took it. And neither of us said anything for a moment, because some things are already said, folded into quarters, worn at the creases. Then her phone buzzed in the olive tote bag, twice in fast succession, and she looked at it without moving and said, "My mother." And then, after a pause, reading, she says she hopes I said something. Nora looked at me. She would like me to report back. I said, "Tell her the pinky promise has been honored." Nora typed. We waited. Her mother's response was a single word, 3 letters, followed by something that was apparently an emoji her mother had recently discovered how to use, because it arrived 6 more times. Nora showed me the screen. We were both laughing, and the kitchen was warm, and the note was on the table between us. And it was my 30th birthday, and none of the reasonable plans I'd had for it had been even remotely close to adequate. 2 months later, I told my own mother, who said, "Nora Finch?" with an expression of such comprehensive unsurprise that I felt briefly embarrassed to be her son. She said she had been waiting for this since we were approximately 14. I said that was not possible. She said, James, she used to find reasons to come over for dinner 3 times a week. I said that proved nothing. My mother looked at me with the patience of a woman who has been right about something for 16 years and no longer requires validation. I told Desmond, my friend Desmond, who has the same function in my life that a compass has in a city I am confident I know well, over coffee the following Sunday. He listened. He said, the one from the street you grew up on? I said yes. He said the one you mentioned in October. I said I had not mentioned her in October. He said, you mentioned the dinner 8 months ago. You said it had been good and you should do it again. He looked at me. That was October. I said nothing. He drank his coffee. He said, Owen. I said, James? He said, right, James, you should have called her in October. I said I knew. He said, she called herself. I said she came in person. He nodded like this was the correct outcome for reasons he had always understood. I resolved to be better at listening to Desmond on the first try. A year later, when people ask how we finally got together, Nora says, he forgot the note, and I didn't. She says this with the smile of a woman who has been right about something for 19 years and wears it very lightly. What she says when we're alone, on quiet evenings when the conversation has gone somewhere honest, that she almost didn't come. That she had the note in her pocket and stood outside my building for 11 minutes before she knocked. That she had a version of the evening prepared in which she gave me the note. I laughed. She laughed. They framed it as a joke. And she went home and put the whole thing down for good. She had prepared for that version. She came anyway. I asked her once, not long after, early enough that the question still had some vulnerability in it, how long she had known. Not suspected. Known. She was quiet for a moment. She was sitting on the couch with her legs tucked up and the olive tote bag on the floor beside her, the way she sat when she was somewhere she was comfortable, and she looked at me and said, Edinburgh, first year. I came home for Christmas and you picked me up from the train, and I got in the car and thought, she stopped. I thought, there it is. And then I thought, well, what do I do with that? She had been 19 years old at a train station in December, and she had looked at me and known, and then spent 11 years carrying it folded into quarters. Because the timing was never right, and the distance was real, and the friendship was too important to risk on something that might not be returned. She kept the note instead. She kept it the way you keep proof of something you want to remain true. And when she was 30 and I was 30, and we were in the same city, and she had run out of reasons to wait, she put it in her pocket and drove 40 minutes and knocked on my door. Nothing about us had appeared overnight. It had simply been there since a Saturday afternoon in October, in 2 handwritings, declared twice. It had been waiting for the right person to pick it up and walk it to the door. She did. I didn't fall in love with Nora Finch on my 30th birthday. I fell in love with the fact that she drove across a cold November city with a piece of paper from 1994 and stood outside my building for 11 minutes, deciding whether to be brave. And then I fell in love with the woman who prepared for the version where I laughed it off and came anyway. I fell in love because the note was in her tote bag, not in a drawer, not in a box, with her. And that is not a small thing. That is 19 years of keeping something safe until it was time. It was time. The note is framed now in the hallway. Her idea. She said it deserved better than a coat pocket. I said it deserved better than a kitchen table. We gave it a wall and a frame and the two handwritings are there in permanent evidence. The oversized letters of two children who were being very careful to make it official. They were more right than they knew. What would you have done if someone showed up on your birthday with a promise you'd both forgotten, or that you thought you'd both forgotten? And have you ever been carrying something for years that you were almost too careful to say out loud? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.